Hi, thank you for being here. My name is Nina Khrushcheva. I'm an interim dean of Milano School of International Affairs, Management and Urban Policy here at the new school, and I'd like to welcome you at this very lovely, one of the first fall evenings of the season. I also would like to extend a special welcome to those of you who are joining us via live stream and encourage the online audience to make sure that you participate in tonight's discussion by submitting your questions in the chat window that should appear on your screen. And if you're using social media, you can easily become part of the conversation with this hashtag, politics and policy. And I hope you appreciate the lovely blue and white colors because it's very seasonal at this time. So we're meeting here today because we all care about political literacy, and at the new school we care about it even more than in other places because sometimes political non-literacy can bring very miserable results in political outcomes for democracy, for the elections. And so these are the questions and answers of what represents political literacy, something that we all seek. Jeff Smith of Urban Policy and I of International Affairs. We are the notorious Milano School junkies of politics, of contemporary politics. And last spring, we concocted this idea that it would be wonderful to have a project, a long-running project, an hour and a year and a half running project that will bring to the public an exciting and engaging series, Politics and Policy 2016. This series combines in-class lectures and assignments with hands-on experience and intellects of both American and global politics experts, and so we dissect the 2016 U.S. presidential elections, providing not only the the American worldview, but also the global worldview and how the world sees American politics today. And, you know, with Donald Trump, it certainly sees it in an interesting way, which eventually we'll talk about as well. So we talk about the evolution of the two-party system. We talk about soccer's impact on world politics, the use of propaganda ideology, political PR, and how it influences images and messages and all the things political. And today is our first inaugural panel. It's called Examination of Voting Rights in the 2016 U.S. Elections, and we'll showcase the insights and practical knowledge of very esteemed experts and provide us with critical understanding of voting and its correlations to presidential campaigns. Please visit milanoschool.org for a course listing that is associated with the series, also a listing of future events. And before I turn over to Professor Smith, who will introduce and moderate the panel. And by the way, the panel is also co-sponsored by Milano's Center for the New York City Affairs and also The Nation magazine. I would very much like to thank those who spent a lot of time organizing this series and this particular event tonight. Now, welcome all. And Jeff, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean Khrushcheva. Thank you all for being here tonight to talk about this important issue of voting rights. In Florida, as one reviewer of Ari Berman's fantastic new history of voting rights at the 50-year anniversary of the VRA noted, in Florida, shark attacks are actually more common than documented cases of voter fraud. And yet, in 2011, Florida shut down voting registration drives in the name of eliminating voter fraud. In his new book, Give Us the Ballot, Ari explores the increasingly sophisticated tactics to keep minorities and also young people who also vote disproportionately Democratic out of the voting booth over the past few decades. By prohibiting restrictions on voting, such as poll taxes, literacy requirements, and grandfather clauses, the Voting Rights Act helped produce a black voting bloc that helped the first African-American president edge Hillary Clinton in key primaries, most notably the South Carolina primary that became such a turning point in 2008. It also helped elect dozens of African-American congressmen, senators, state representatives, and mayors throughout the country, and in particular, throughout the South. But now, as Ari shows in his very thorough new book, the VRA, the renewal of which was supported by overwhelming bipartisan majorities in the 1980s, the 1990s, and even the early 2000s, is now under assault as never before. As we approach 2016, the most important election in our lifetime, I'm just kidding, but you're going to hear that constantly, Ari explains how we came so far only to be fighting the very same battles that we thought had been won 50 years ago. Like a determined sleuth, Ari investigates every possible cause of our national backsliding on voting rights, and he finds no shortage of blameworthy parties. There's the Supreme Court, led by John Roberts, that nullified a key Voting Rights Act provision requiring states with a history of discrimination to pre-clear election law changes with the federal government. There's the leading conservative activist who admits, I don't really want everybody to vote. Our whole leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down. He said that on the record. And there is, of course, Ronald Reagan, who kicked off his 1980 general election campaign in Neshoba County, Mississippi. Yes, the exact same county out of more than 2,000 he had to choose from in this country, where civil rights workers Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner were brutally murdered 17 years earlier. And he said on that day, the spirit of Jefferson Davis lives on in this year's Republican platform. These are the things that Ari Berman chronicles in Give Us the Ballot. Ari shows us many, many things, but perhaps nothing more important than the ahistoricism of America, as he implicitly cautions us that, as the old saying goes, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. Give Us the Ballot ensures that we will not forget again. Without further ado, coming to us from The Nation, Ari Berman.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming, and thank you to the New School for having me, and Jeff for organizing this event. Jeff and I actually taught together here in 2012, which was a very exciting time to be teaching, and so I feel like I'm in some ways back home. So I just want to sort of give a brief overview of voting rights, both the history and where we are before we get to this awesome panel, and I'm super happy to have Chrissy Greer and Maggie Haberman here, two esteemed leaders in this field and many others to discuss with us. But Jeff mentioned Ronald Reagan, and I'm sure many of you watched all 3 hours of the last Republican debate at the Reagan Library, and Reagan famously described the U.S. as the shining city on the hill, the country that had exported democracy all across the globe. And in fact, that is one of the main ways that America likes to think of itself and brand itself. But there's another side of the story, a darker story about American democracy, which is that democracy has never been something that all of us have enjoyed. If you look at when the U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1787, only white male property owners could vote in the 11 states of the Union. You look at 1865, when the Civil War ended, black men could only vote freely in 5 states. You look at 1920, when the 19th Amendment was passed, giving women the right to vote. That was a right almost exclusively enjoyed by white women at the time. And even when the country has passed protections that specifically guarantee voting rights, our commitment to enforcing them has always been waning. The 15th Amendment of 1870 said very, very clearly that the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And for a few years, those words really meant something during Reconstruction. We had black senators and congressmen and governors from states like Mississippi and Louisiana, something that we haven't had ever since. But what happened is our commitment to making sure that everyone could vote, it didn't last long. Federal troops pulled out of the South in 1876. Jim Crow began. We saw things like literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, property requirements, backed up by a system of violence and fraud and social and economic retribution, all of which necessitated the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is really the starting point of my book. And so to understand what happened in 1965, you have to understand that the Voting Rights Act essentially enforced a previous piece of legislation, the 15th Amendment, that was ignored for basically almost 100 years. And the Voting Rights Act was such a transformative piece of legislation because it said that they was going to end this debate over voting rights once and for all. And it was going to do this by giving the federal government the power that it hadn't had before to really prevent voting discrimination from existing. And the way the Voting Rights Act did that was a few different ways. The first off is it outlawed things like literacy tests and poll taxes that had kept people from voting for so long. In places like Selma, Alabama in 1965, only 2% of African Americans were registered to vote, and they were blocked because of things like literacy tests. The Voting Rights Act got rid of them overnight. Then within days, it sent federal officials to the South to register voters. Hundreds and then thousands and then eventually millions. And this was an instance of the federal government using its power for the absolute good and doing things that the states were just unwilling or unable to do. And so you saw that these tests were outlawed overnight. You saw that people began to be registered in very large numbers, and you saw that federal officials stayed in the South to make sure that elections weren't stolen. And then over a longer period of time, what the Voting Rights Act said is that those states with the worst histories of voting discrimination, places like Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia and South Carolina, they were going to have to approve their voting changes with the federal government to make sure that the Voting Rights Act didn't have the same trajectory as Reconstruction, which is it lasts for 10 years, all these good things happen, then it ends violently and abruptly. That the Voting Rights Act was going to remain impactful for decades after its passage. And indeed it was. And so I spend a lot of my book telling the story of what I call the revolution of 1965, how we got someone like Congressman John Lewis in the Congress, how we got President Obama, how we got to be a really, truly interracial, multiracial democracy, which we were not before the passage of the Voting Rights Act. But I also talk a lot about, in my book, about the backlash to voting rights, what I call the counter-revolution, how we have a country that for 50 years has challenged the legitimacy of the Voting Rights Act and tried to thwart it. And they've tried to thwart it in different ways, which we're going to talk about on this panel. Initially, when the Voting Rights Act was challenged, and it was challenged almost immediately after its passage, weeks after its passage, the southern states, led by South Carolina, made a traditional states' rights argument. They said that the federal government didn't have the power to tell states how to run their elections. And the Supreme Court, in a resounding 8-1 decision, said absolutely, that's exactly what the Voting Rights Act is supposed to do. It's supposed to set these qualifications for states, because otherwise you're just going to have things like literacy tests and poll taxes and grandfather clauses in states like Alabama indefinitely. And so the Voting Rights Act is going to be this very powerful weapon to make sure these things don't happen any longer. And so as a result of the constitutionality of the VRA being upheld, people once again thought this debate was settled. And you started to see in the 1970s and the 1980s a really significant chunk of black officials, Hispanic officials, Asian American officials begin to be elected. And then when that happened, a new argument against the Voting Rights Act was made, that the Voting Rights Act was going to lead to things like affirmative action in electoral politics, quota systems at the ballot box, proportional representation. This was an argument that the Reagan administration was making about all civil rights laws, that laws that were meant to stop discrimination, to remedy discrimination, had become in and of themselves discriminatory. And this was an argument that a young lawyer in the Reagan Justice Department, John Roberts, made repeatedly and relentlessly and carried with him to the Supreme Court 30 years later. Well, that argument largely failed, because we had a Congress that reauthorized the Voting Rights Act, we had a Supreme Court that by and large was supportive of the Voting Rights Act, and we had states across the country that were willing to enforce this law. And so then there's a new phase of backlash to voting rights. Starting in 2000 with George W. Bush, we started to hear a lot about voter fraud. At the same time, when African Americans become such an influential bloc in the Democratic Party and the demographics are changing so rapidly. And I think many people viewed Barack Obama's election in particular as this major turning point for voting rights, that it would once again end the discussion, that we would see the amazing turnout, and the 2008 electorate was the most diverse in American history, as the new normal in American politics. And going forward, both Republicans and Democrats would have to replicate Obama's coalition. And many people, myself included, predicted that the opposition party would have to reach out to these new constituencies, would have to reach out to younger voters and voters of color and women voters. What we didn't anticipate was that instead of reaching out to these voters, the opposition party would instead make it harder for these people to actually vote. And so beginning in 2011, when all these states flipped from blue to red during the 2010 election and the Tea Party became so influential within the Republican Party, we began to see a wave of new barriers to the ballot box. And that's when I really started covering this issue, when I noticed that states like, Jeff mentioned Florida, but it wasn't just Florida, places like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Texas and Kansas, they all were passing laws designed to make it harder for certain people to participate in the political process. This was things like shutting down voter registration drives, cutting early voting, disenfranchising ex-felons, purging the voting rolls, and requiring strict forms of government-issued ID to cast a ballot that you never needed in any previous election. All of this was happening at the same time. So between 2011 and 2012, 180 new voting restrictions were introduced in 41 states, and half the states in the country started passing new laws making it harder to vote. So I found this to be a really disquieting development in the wake of Obama's election, and I covered the 2012 election all the way through, looking at who could and couldn't participate. And many of these efforts actually did backfire in 2012. They were either blocked in court, or they were repealed in states, or they led to a bigger organizing efforts to make people overcome them in states like Ohio and in Florida, where we saw such long lines on election night 2012. But what happened after that election is the Supreme Court heard a challenge to the Voting Rights Act. And John Roberts argued that the very success of the Voting Rights Act, the election and re-election of Barack Obama, the election of black mayors in places like Selma, Alabama, and Philadelphia, Mississippi, which Jeff mentioned earlier, where Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner were killed, that the very success of the Voting Rights Act meant that its most powerful provisions were no longer necessary, that those states with the worst histories of voting discrimination no longer needed to approve their voting changes with the federal government. What this has meant is that laws that were previously blocked as discriminatory, like Texas's voter ID law, were allowed to go into effect, that new states passed tougher voting restrictions. A month after that decision, North Carolina essentially repealed or curtailed everything in that state that encouraged people to vote, and that states felt like they had a green light once again to make it harder to vote, that the federal government wasn't going to be able to stop them like they did in 1965. So I think we're entering a whole new era in terms of the struggle over voting rights. The 2016 election is going to be the first presidential election in 50 years without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. As the demographics of the country continue to change, as minority voters are an increasingly influential part of the Democratic coalition, along with younger voters, that means that there will be, I think, unfortunately, more routine and sophisticated attempts to try to keep people from the ballot box. And the last thing I'll say before we turn over to this panel is that it was so important for me to tell the story of what happened since 1965, because so many accounts of the civil rights movement end with Selma, Alabama in 1965 as this triumphant culmination of the civil rights movement. And it was this incredibly triumphant event, but it wasn't the culmination of the civil rights movement. That the Voting Rights Act didn't end the debate over voting rights, didn't end the debate over civil rights. It just started a whole new debate. And that whole new debate is the debate that we're going to discuss tonight, and really what I devote my book to try to chronicling. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ari. That was fantastic. Now I'm going to call up two more people who are going to join us. First, Maggie Haberman. Maggie is a former writer for the New York Post. She also wrote for Politico, along with Alex Burns. Maggie wrote probably the most well-read and most important, I would argue, blog of the 2012 election. She's now come to the New York Times, where she is national political reporter and has been covering the voting rights beat for the Times this election cycle. Maggie Haberman. Maggie actually suffered a concussion this morning, and so we are very, very glad that she's here. But
Bear with me.
bear with her is what I'm trying to say. So thanks.
Thanks, Jeff.
And then I also want to introduce Professor Chrissy Greer. Chrissy is a professor, newly tenured professor. Congratulations, Chrissy, at Fordham University. She wrote an award-winning book called Black Ethnics, which analyzes the voting behavior of black immigrant groups across the country. She is an expert on campaigns and elections, race and politics, and immigrant politics around the country, but especially here in New York City. And she will also be joining the panel. Chrissy Greer. So I want to start out, Ari, and delve in a little bit more to the Republican and sort of conservative rationale behind a lot of this. They say, we've got to stop rampant voter fraud. Talk about the evidence of voter fraud that they have uncovered.
Well, the evidence has always been pretty scarce. The Bush administration launched a huge probe into voter fraud after the 2000 election when there was a radical change in the Justice Department. And the Justice Department had always pretty much, with a few exceptions, loyally enforced the Voting Rights Act. And in the Bush administration, they had a very different perspective. They weren't going to enforce the Voting Rights Act. They were instead going to look for voter fraud. And they gave U.S. attorneys and other people as much resources as they needed to be able to go after this issue. And what happened was, over a 5-year period, they didn't find a single instance of a voter going to the polls and impersonating another voter, which was the type of voter fraud they said was most common. They found small instances of voter fraud, people who had a green card and didn't realize they couldn't vote, for example, or small things like trying to rig an election for mayor in some obscure town, but they didn't find any sort of concerted effort to try to swing elections by use of voter fraud. And this rhetoric really intensified not after Obama's election, but during the 2008 campaign, when we heard a tremendous amount about Acorn, particularly on Fox News. And Fox covered Acorn relentlessly. And it's definitely true that Acorn was not the carefulest organization.
Why don't you back up a little bit and just flesh out who Acorn is and what they did?
Sure. So Acorn was a group that was founded to try to register primarily low-income voters and voters of color. And they had a lot of success in doing so. But part of the problem with Acorn was that some of their model was that they would pay people hourly to register a certain number of voters. So they would have targets they had to hit. And in some places where people weren't that committed to the work they were doing, they were just trying to make a paycheck, they would register voters who didn't exist. And we famously heard the case about Mickey Mouse registering to vote. But where it may be true that Mickey Mouse registered in a few places, Mickey Mouse never actually voted. That under the Help America Vote Act, if you were a first-time voter, you actually had to show some sort of proof of identity. Not strict government-issued ID, but you had to show a utility bill or a bank statement or something like that. So Mickey Mouse would have had to have a residence, he would have had to have bills, he would have had to have a whole lot of documentation to actually be able to vote, which he never did. And the last thing I'll say about the voter impersonation fraud, which is interesting, is that even though there's all this talk about voter impersonation, and there's been numerous studies on this. The study that I like to cite the most is that since 2000, there have been 31 cases of voter impersonation out of 1 billion votes cast. So by any stretch of the imagination, it's not a major problem. The small amount of fraud that does exist in the political system is absentee ballot fraud. But ironically, in many states that have passed voter ID requirements, they actually exempt absentee ballots from these new requirements, which leads me to believe that it's not necessarily about voter fraud, even if it's a good faith effort to stop voter fraud, but it's about something else.
Maggie, why do you think Acorn was such a potent talking point for Republicans in 2008?
I mean, I think for a couple of reasons. I think in part because of the nexus with, you had this community organizer candidate in President Obama, so I think it fit very neatly. into a paradigm. I think to Ari's point, there was a lot of work that Acorn did that was very positive, and it was very easy to seize on the examples that were negative. And also 2008 was the first, the blogosphere was really coming into its own. And I think with social media and the preponderance of it, that was the first cycle when Twitter was really active, not active the way it is now. But you did have things kind of ricochet around before you could totally fact check them, or before people would fact check them. So I think that was a big piece of it. And I think that, especially in this city, Acorn has had a real stronghold and been a very important group. So it was sort of surreal as a reporter who had covered New York City elections and watched the work Acorn did, to watch it get characterized the way it did. But it became sort of part of this larger narrative by Republicans of, Obama, dangerous, trying to sort of rip apart a certain fabric. And I think that's why it was so potent.
Thank you. Speaking of Twitter, if any of you are on Twitter right now and you have a question, or if anyone at home on the live stream has a question, use the hashtag politics and policy and tweet your question out. And in between now and audience Q&A, someone here will bring me up a couple questions from the audience that are tweeted. Chrissy, so talk to us about how some of these restrictions work, kind of what some of these restrictions are, and Ari, feel free to jump in here. Early voting, or voter ID, or bans or new restrictions on provisional voting. Talk to us about how those impact both Black Americans and immigrants.
Right. So what we have to remember is that Black Americans haven't been voting for a very long time, full stop, as a group, right? So the Voting Rights Act in 1965 is literally 50 years old this year. And so legally, African Americans are essentially new to the voting process, right? So if we look at the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, and the Immigration Act of 65 as a triumvirate, right? Those three work in conjunction together in expanding the rights of sort of Black civil liberties.
In Mississippi in 1960, 6% of Blacks were registered to vote in 1960.
Right. And we also have to remember that voting and registration are a two-stage process, right? So in the book that I'm writing now about all the history of all African Americans who have run for the presidency or been nominated from 1872 to the present, we can't forget that Jesse Jackson registering 2 million people to vote in 84 and an additional 2 million plus in 88 is a significant contribution to actually Blacks entering into even the possibility of voting, right? Because many states don't have same-day voting, and it's very difficult to vote, and this is well before motor voter laws. And so there are these additional barriers because there isn't a tradition of voting in many Black communities, right? The same way as a former politician, there isn't a tradition of donating to politicians, which is a totally different panel, which hopefully you'll have in the spring. So thinking of those things and thinking of descriptive versus substantive representation, and how also
Flesh that out a little bit for the non-political scientists.
descriptive representation meaning having someone who looks like you who is an elected official, and substantive representation is having someone who's an elected official who actually works on your behalf. Now, there's every now and again this perfect alignment of the cosmos where you actually have someone who looks like you and also works on your behalf, and then sometimes that's not the case. So the easiest example I give people, if you are a left-leaning sort of Democrat, and you think of someone,
Tim Scott?
yeah, or J.C. Watts.
J.C.
right?
Watts.
J.C. Watts was, one of the congressmen from Minnesota?
Oklahoma,
of course. JC stands for Julius Caesar Watts. And so, he decided not to become a member of the CBC, but he's a Black elected official, but did not represent many of the needs of the vast majority of Black America. Similarly with Mia Love, who's a newly elected member of Congress from Utah. So I say all this to say, when we think about the Voting Rights Act, we have to think about it in conjunction with the Immigration Act and the Civil Rights Act. And so those three things are essentially pretty recent in the voting history of Black Americans and also Black immigrants. And so because of residential segregation, because so many Black immigrants oftentimes find themselves living with Black Americans when they move to this country, many of the issues that Black Americans have faced also trickle into Black ethnic voting opportunities or lack thereof.
Since you brought him up, it's worth noting that J.C. Watts, when he told his father that he was going to run for Congress as a Republican, his own father told him that being black and voting Republican was like being a chicken and voting for Colonel Sanders. Anyway, apropos when delineating between descriptive and substantive representation, Ari, you wanted to jump in.
Well, I just want to talk a little bit more about these types of voting methods and why they're so important. And what happened during the 2000 election in Florida was that there was a massive voter purge in the run-up to that election. And thousands of people were wrongly labeled as felons and prevented from voting, because Florida was one of those states that didn't allow ex-felons to vote, a ban that dated back to the Jim Crow era, when African Americans were far more likely to be faced with felonies for crimes such as looking at a white woman. And so what happened in Florida was there was this massive voter purge. Many people were wrongly told they were felons and were purged from the voting rolls. These were disproportionately African-American voters. African-Americans were 11% of Florida's electorate, but 44% of those on the purge list. And so when people showed up and were told in 2000 that they were felons, this was disproportionately hurting African-American voters who were voting 90% for Al Gore. The NAACP sued Florida after the election, and they found that 12,000 people were wrongly labeled as felons and potentially prevented from voting. And that was 22 times George W. Bush's margin of victory. And I think that sent a really bad precedent, because the precedent that it set to many Republicans was that small manipulations in the electoral process could make a very big difference. And so, for example, in Ohio in 2004, there were far fewer voting machines in predominantly black and Democratic districts than there were in predominantly white and Republican districts. I'm not saying that was intentional. It could have just happened because the state distributed the voting machines in such a way that that just happened. But regardless of why it happened, what we saw was in Election Day 2004 in Ohio, African Americans voted for 52 minutes. Waited to vote for 52 minutes, while white Ohioans only waited 18 minutes. So I can't do the math, but it's like 3 times as long or something like that. And so what we saw is that when Barack Obama is elected, there's already a precedent sort of below the surface for restricting voting rights, that Republicans already realize that some of these things can be cut back to great impact. And Obama's elected because of things like early voting, because of things like same-day voter registration, which bring more voters into the political process. So if you can just cut back on these things a little, not just eliminate them, but just cut back on them a little in close races, this can make a very big difference.
I think there's a great documentary called No Umbrella, which is about the 2004 presidential race in Ohio. And you see sort of blacks in a particular district, and they have the machines, they just don't have the ballots. And so I think this is something that Nina Turner was trying to highlight when she ran for Secretary of State in Ohio and lost. But she was really trying to make a national conversation, especially among black voters, to pay attention to these non-sexy races. No offense, Secretary of State, State Senate, State House, because these are the people that actually control lots of things. And many times, I think it's 80% or 70% of Secretary of States in the country are Republican.
That's right. I mean, this is what we saw after 2010, right? When you had this wave of legislative changes in a lot of states where you ended up having a Republican legislature and a Republican governor, and you started seeing what you're talking about with these sort of shavings at the margins. It just was writ large in many, many places.
So you talked about the purging of the voting rolls, Ari, and Chrissy, you talk about the non-sexy offices, and it reminds me that I should probably point out, although we're talking a lot tonight about different Republican strategies, in St. Louis at least, it has traditionally been the Democratic establishment that purges the voting rolls. Every 4 years after the presidential election, the aldermanic elections take place the following spring, and this I've found is not isolated to St. Louis. And the local powers that be that control local election boards, they don't care really so much about the presidential election. They just want to make sure that the same people who've always voted for aldermen and committee people are the only people voting the next spring. And so they'll immediately purge the voting rolls of all these new people, young people, immigrants that started voting that got all worked up, excited about the presidential election, and take them off the voting rolls in time for the spring aldermanic election in the odd year, which unfortunate, but just
Right.
I think embodies the fact that it's not just limited to being a Republican.
I think Republicans get a bad rap. I think Southerners get a bad rap, but I think it's very clear that Democrats are just fine with who votes for them especially in smaller races, and they're not actually, in many places, doing the get out the vote efforts that they could and should. They know who their base is, and so having new people in, even if they are Caribbeans or Africans or Latinos, they aren't exactly sure who these people will be. And so we know, especially when we think about Congress, about the obscene incumbency advantage. And then in state house races, in many places, it's the same thing. So many Democrats aren't ringing the alarm to sort of change things. They'll let the Republicans, though, sort of seem like the bad guys.
Yeah, our mutual friend, Paul Freimer, a Princeton political scientist, wrote a fantastic book about this very issue called Uneasy Alliance, about the alliance between the Democratic Party and blacks from the Civil War to the present day. A fascinating account of exactly what you just described, basically the ways in which the Democratic Party, while in certain times when it's convenient, has tried to mobilize black votes, has only done so, again, when it's convenient, and has not truly worked to engage the black community substantively, but has just worked basically on last-minute voter mobilization. That has, I think, come back to haunt, the party.
Right. And the thing is, though, black voters and new black voters, meaning Caribbean and African voters, are incredibly savvy. And so it's this constant tension between protecting your interests versus advancing your interests. And oftentimes that calculus is, well, let's just, stick with the devil to protect the little bit that you do have, as opposed to moving forward to actually advance it. And so that advancement comes in these pockets where sometimes you get this convergence of descriptive and substantive representation in a 2008 election, if you believe that Obama sort of is that representative. But in many ways, it stays in protectionist phase. And so that's the larger question about black advancement politically, sort of moving from protest to politics in the 21st century.
I want to go back for a second to the Republican Party, because one of the things that I try to show in my book is that there was a long bipartisan consensus, particularly in Congress, for the Voting Rights Act among many, many Republicans. And this was done for a few different reasons. It was done partly because some African Americans actually got votes from minority voters, or actually believed that they could
Some
get
Republicans.
votes. Some Republicans could get votes from minority voters, or that they would be harmed if they didn't even try. And it was also because some Republicans really believed in the Voting Rights Act. That after Selma, Alabama occurred, you saw many people in Congress see the need for a Voting Rights Act. You saw that act passed overwhelmingly, and you saw that it had to be reauthorized. Parts of it had to be reauthorized because they were on a temporary basis. And when the Voting Rights Act had to be reauthorized, there was always strong Republican and Democratic support for reauthorizing it. But it wasn't just like everyone went along with this. There was a major struggle within the Republican Party over the position on the Voting Rights Act. And you had the Nixon administration, the Reagan administration, the George W. Bush administration all try to gut the Voting Rights Act. And they were unsuccessful at doing so because different Republicans in Congress at different times stood up to their own party. Whether it was people like Everett Dirksen, the senator from Illinois in the 1960s, or it was someone like Bob Dole, senator from Kansas in the 1980s, or it was Representative Jim Sensenbrenner from Wisconsin in the early 2000s. And so there was always this kind of push and pull and civil war within the Republican Party over those who supported the Voting Rights Act and those who weren't crazy about it. And those who supported it always won. The difference now is that the people within the Republican Party who support a strong Voting Rights Act, they are now the minority. They're not extinct. They're still in Congress. I still talk to them, but they just don't have any power anymore. And the whole center of gravity has shifted away from that coalition to a coalition that's much more influenced by the Tea Party, much more skeptical of the Voting Rights Act, and principally concerned about whether they're going to win their next Republican primary, where this issue doesn't help them, it actually hurts them. Right.
Talk about that, Maggie.
Yeah, I mean, you could sort of take that issue set and expand it out to almost, a dozen others, right? And you're sort of seeing the demise of Scott Walker is to some extent the
Scott Walker dropped out of the presidential election.
right before this forum.
Right
You're
before.
all crushed.
Yeah.
Crushed by that news.
Go ahead, Maggie.
No, I mean, Scott Walker was one of the states where there were restrictions on voting rights under his watch. Scott Walker is a governor who, as everyone knows, has made his bones as a union buster. And so, to the point that Ari was making, this is a Congress that is radicalized and is angry, and it is a base that is radicalized and angry. And so there is no incentive to do anything other than what is good for being at home. And in Scott Walker's case, dropping out was what was good for preserving his governorship. Going further would have damaged him. But there is a I mean, I don't want to tie this directly to what happened over the weekend, but I do think that there is. It's important. You may have seen that there was a discussion on some of the Sunday shows where Ben Carson, who is now a leading Republican candidate, suggested that he wouldn't be comfortable with a Muslim in the White House. And this came after something that Donald Trump had said, where Donald Trump was asked a question at a town hall, and there was this insistence that the questioner at the Trump town hall was a plant. And Ben Carson's, I think it was his campaign manager, got asked about this earlier today, and he said something like 80% of the Republican voters view this the way we do. That is, in fact, the case. And so there is not much incentive for making things different. It is also, to your point about voter mobilization, I mean, this is why you see a Democratic strategy that you're seeing right now where Hillary Clinton is talking extensively about the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, where Hillary Clinton is speaking. Some of her boldest moves in the campaign, and Jeff and I have talked about this before, have really been on the topic of race. And you can argue that she has not been on the topic of the economy or the topic of Wall Street reining in. But that is one area where she has been. And it does all tie sort of to the same place. But you are not going to see much impetus in Congress for people to stand up. I mean, there was a to me the pivotal moment, and then I'll shut up on my rant here. But the pivotal moment where you saw the type of Republicans you're talking about who are going to stand up and sort of say this, we can't do this anymore. John McCain was often seen as somebody like that, and he was a person who in 2008 took a moment questioning President Obama's faith and really turned it around. So there was this moment when Trump insulted McCain's war hero status a couple of weeks ago, and there was a reverberation around Washington to say this is going to be the moment when Trump is going to, he's going to sink because he offended John McCain. The base hates John McCain, and increasingly the base grows, and so you have McCain is, I think, facing a primary challenge now, and it's going to be very interesting to see how that race turns out. But you can see the tilting of power in the Republican Party in such a way that it is moving away from a lot of the gains that have taken place.
Can I just jump in about Hillary and her new move on race? And I'm going to put that in quotes. Just because I think she also has looked at the numbers and realized it's black women who have held it down for Obama, who made it happen in 2008 and then made it happen again, even more so at 65% of the entire black electorate. So she knows that black women aren't natural fans.
Crucial.
And she knows that they're beyond crucial, and she knows that they can stay home.
Right.
Worse than even just voting for someone else. And so I think that's where this shift or
that's what I was
emergence.
I was in my tongue-tied, concussed way attempting to say, but right, I agree with you.
Yeah.
I mean, I think regardless of why they're doing this, I think we're seeing a really huge shift on the topic of voting rights between the Democratic presidential candidates and the Republican candidates. And it's really staggering to see the difference in their proposals. Not just Hillary, but Bernie Sanders, Martin O'Malley, they've endorsed things like automatic voter registration, 20 days of early voting, a constitutional amendment to guarantee the right to vote. I mean, some of these proposals have
full restoration
of ex-felons. Some of these laws have a better chance of passing in the short term than others. But it's a really expansive vision of voting rights, well beyond what Obama outlined in 2008 or in 2012, or what Al Gore or John Kerry even considered in 2000 or 2004, when this topic basically never came up. And then the Republicans, to the extent that they talk about the issue, they talk about it in terms of voter fraud and restricting voting rights. And even candidates who at various times have done the right thing, like Jeb Bush, who supported for a time early voting in Florida.
Yeah.
They never talk about that. Jeb Bush doesn't talk about early voting as part of reaching out to new constituencies, because somehow early voting, something that was widely popular amongst both Democrats and Republicans, is now something that's thought of as toxic and only helping Democrats. And so it's unfortunate that there is such a wide gulf between the party, because I'm of the view that as long as this issue is relentlessly politicized, we're not really going to make a lot of progress on it.
But isn't voter fraud a Republican dog whistle, right? I mean, in some ways, aren't Republicans saying that they're so worried about voter fraud because they essentially still see this president, our president, as a fraudulent election? You know, it's somehow he has stolen this election, not once but twice, right? And so we see this increase in rhetoric over time, especially with Obama, just because for them, it seems like this could not have happened, not just in 2008, but also again in 2000.
Well, I think the dog whistles move beyond that. I think a lot of it has to do with immigration now. So much of the rhetoric about voter fraud is about illegal immigrants registering to vote, and you hear this constantly. And Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach, who's kind of the national figure in the Republican Party, speaking on these issues, he has instituted all sorts of things in Kansas, including requiring proof of citizenship to register to vote, and this two-tiered election system where tens of thousands of people who had been voting in the past had their registration suspended, with really no evidence that any illegal immigrants would actually want to register to vote. And I did an NPR interview once with Kobach, and the interviewer asked him a question: why would an undocumented immigrant who is here principally probably to work want to vote and risk everything to get hit with a felony and then be deported? And Kobach said, well, maybe their carrier, the person who brought them here, was paying them to illegally vote. And I'm just thinking, like, this is such an absurd hypothetical, but this is like the standard bearer of the Republican Party. So I keep waiting for Trump to start talking about voter fraud. Like, I know it's coming, because this is the next wave of all the anti-immigrant stuff, is that not just are they here illegally to steal our jobs, but they're here illegally to steal our votes as well.
It requires a level of operations that he's not doing, that I understand what you're saying.
I will say, listening to the response of Kobach is disturbing. I will tell you, when I ran for Congress, there were like 7 or 8 candidate forums, and they were all pretty sparsely attended, never more than like 40 or 50 people. And then there was a forum on a Saturday morning at 8:30 a.m. just for new Americans, and there were 300 people in the room, none of whom could vote. But they all wanted to come out at 8:30 in the morning just to listen. And I just remember how inspiring that was. You know, you talked about the sort of savvy and the deep interest that immigrants have despite not being able to vote. And I guess in a perverse sense, that is something that Republicans can sort of feel, that they can sort of capitalize on or exploit that enthusiasm for wanting to be part of the process on the part of new Americans. So let me ask about some concrete stuff. There's been I think Democrats are handling it differently than they did 5 years ago. 5 years ago, I think Democrats were kind of blindsided by some of this legislation at the state level, and and basically the legislation was passed before they understood how profoundly it would shape the electorate. Maggie, you've been on the beat looking at some of the lawsuits that Democrats or Democratic affiliated groups have filed proactively, suggesting that certain laws would be likely to disenfranchise certain groups. Talk to us about those lawsuits, and then let's talk about what we think the outcome will be.
Sure. So there's a bunch of different lawsuits, and there is, in some cases, a converging of interests. So one of the most significant ones is in I'm going to do a terrible job about explicating the specifics of it, so just forgive me just because of head. But there was a North Carolina suit that was filed about a year ago, and it was a bunch of different plaintiffs. The NAACP, I believe, was one of them, and there were a couple of others. And then there's always a local plaintiff who represents whose voting rights were impinged upon. This was brought by Mark Elias, who is one of the premier Democratic voting rights attorneys. I guess the premier, right, ish, or one of them. And he's with a firm that does a lot of these types of suits. He has been involved in it for a very long time. He is also Hillary Clinton's campaign counsel. And so there has been sort of a convergence of interests for a while. North Carolina was a place where there were a bunch of restrictions that were put into place and that were very easy to seize upon, but it became clear in advance of the midterms, where Democrats did very poorly, that the voting rights issue was going to become a huge problem. And Democrats were indeed blindsided by it. I think that was a good way of putting it. In 2012, you saw the Obama campaign try in Ohio to deal with some restrictions on early vote. It was early voting, I think, right? But it was really very surgical. There were these discussions among Democrats, with Mark Elias, with other operatives at the end of last year in particular, about targets where they thought that their voters could be most impacted, that were in places where there had been these restrictions. So Virginia was one, Ohio was one again, and Ohio was not a surprise. Ohio was in large measure where the election was won in 2012. But basically, these are all different cases that make different arguments about exactly what has been impacted, but they all have the same point, which is to try to push back with plenty of lead time. I mean, the idea was to get these suits going early, and these suits are very
Because you need a lot of lead time.
You need a lot of yes, and because you end up basically, you lose one leg of the battle and then you keep coming back.
And you know the federal judiciary is probably pretty still stacked with Reagan judges.
Correct. And so so basically the end game was essentially to and it ends up sounding like it's all about, Republicans will argue this is about trying to simply boost voter turnout. Republicans will argue these are phantom suits. There's nothing real here. This is just about getting your supporters on board. The flip side argument is, to Ari's point, there have been studies, many of them, that show that there is no widespread example of voter fraud to push back on. And that is basically what ends up being the subtext of these suits. You have seen George Soros, who's a major philanthropist and billionaire, is funding some portion of the North Carolina suit, but he's not the only one. And there is a lot of concern about essentially how these suits can go. But the North Carolina one has been going on by far the longest. You can probably speak more specifically to that one than I can.
Well, I think that challenging these laws is complicated both practically and strategically.
Right.
It's complicated practically because now under the Voting Rights Act, laws can only be challenged once they're in effect or once they've passed. And so it's a very lengthy process. Right. And so you take Texas's voter ID law, which is a good example. That voter ID law was blocked before it became law under the Voting Rights Act, the provision that those states with the worst histories of discrimination, like Texas, had to approve their laws, had to get approval for their laws. And Texas's law was blocked because the courts found on multiple levels that African Americans and Hispanics were less likely to have a form of government-issued ID and also less likely to have access to them, that a third of counties in Texas didn't have a DMV office, and if you were a low-income voter or poor voter or a voter with disabilities or an elderly voter whose driver's license expired and you lived in a rural county in Texas and you didn't have a driver's license anymore, you couldn't drive, how are you going to get to a county 100 miles away to get to a DMV office? And there were real costs associated with getting these underlying documents you needed for an ID, like a birth certificate. You're trying to jump in.
I'm going to jump in because one of our audience members tried to jump in, or live stream viewers. It's at Jason Watt, whose question is, should we focus on programs like the New York City ID program, that Council Speaker Melissa Mark Viverito has championed? Should we focus more on trying to adopt programs like that instead of trying to fight voter ID laws on the backside?
Well, I mean, I think you should do both. I mean, that's I think in an ideal world, everyone would have an ID and it wouldn't be an issue. But as long as everyone doesn't have this ID and it disproportionately falls on certain groups, I think that people have a legal responsibility to challenge these laws. And the Texas law has been blocked. And so just to finish my thought, the Texas law was blocked, and then it was allowed to go into effect after the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. Then it was challenged again and has subsequently been struck down again, both at the lower court level and by the Court of Appeals, written by a George W. Bush appointee, quite surprisingly. But in the interim, That law was allowed to go into effect for the 2014 election. People who had voted all their lives were turned away from the polls. These were heartbreaking stories that I write about in my book. To challenge this law was extremely costly. It was an extremely lengthy process, and it's not over yet. It could very well go back, well, it could very well go up to the Supreme Court, and no one really knows what's going to happen there. So even the successes these days feel more like losses because they take so long, because they're so expensive, because voters are disenfranchised in the meantime. And everyone is terrified of one of these cases going before the Supreme Court. And that's why it's interesting to see Mark Elias, Hillary Clinton's lawyer, who I hope is not watching this, kind of throw everything at the wall and see what sticks.
There's been a lot.
That's exactly what the voting rights groups don't want to
Right.
do. They want to be very strategic about which cases they file to see what will go before the Supreme Court, because everyone's worried about the Supreme Court further gutting the Voting Rights Act.
Right. I mean, we know, we've watched as the LGBTQ rights movement has progressed. We've seen that as, I can't remember who once said this, but Supreme Court decisions sort of like they follow
They follow the sort of where
I mean, they follow public opinion, absolutely, and they're usually a little bit late,
Yes.
But they get there, and they look at the election returns. You know, whoever first said that. So, here's my question. I want to put it to all you guys. I've never seen a poll of a state where voters in any state didn't favor voter ID.
I can tell you.
I know in Missouri. Okay, I know in Missouri it was overwhelming. It was about 85% supported voter ID when there was when it was put to the ballot. And how should Democrats, or how should progressives, or how should African Americans or New Americans, how should we reframe the issue in order to try to either get a majority so that A, it can help legislatively, but B, it could help as courts take public opinion into account?
Well, first off, there was a voter ID referendum in Minnesota in 2012, and it began with 80% support, and it eventually failed. It was eventually defeated because, and this is Minnesota, right, a very good government state, a very liberal state, but still it was the first time that a voter ID initiative had ever been defeated by voters. And it was because the messaging was such that not only did not everyone have this government-issued ID, not only was there no fraud to necessitate such an ID, but it was actually going to disrupt an electoral system in Minnesota that worked pretty well. That Minnesota had very high voter turnout, that people liked things like same-day voter registration there, which a voter ID law would potentially complicate or eliminate. And so that was an example of being able to defeat it more on good government grounds, which may not work in a place like Missouri or Texas. I mean, to me, I think there's a few different things that you have to say about them. One is that clearly not everyone has the strict forms of ID. So, I mean, I'm not against requiring some sort of ID. I'm against a law like Texas law that says that you can vote with a handgun permit, but not a state university ID. I think when people see it from that perspective, they start to think about it a little differently. So it's that not everyone has the ID, that there are burdens to getting them, that not everyone has a copy of their birth certificate, for example, which you need to get a driver's license in many states, that there are real costs, that people don't have them, that they are discriminatory, but that they're also part of a larger effort. This is not just about requiring a government-issued ID. It's about doing things like cutting early voting that are very unpopular. Try polling early voting. Everyone likes early voting.
Yeah.
Early voting's not unpopular. So why are people cutting early voting in Ohio and Florida? Why do they want people to wait for 7 hours online like they did in Florida to cast a ballot? So I think to some extent the voting rights movement, while arguing about voter ID laws, they may lose this particular one because most people do have an ID, but they have to frame it as part of this larger battle over things that are more popular.
So,
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
well, so what do you think about the Democratic strategy? You talked, Maggie, about, and you talked, Ari, about the pretty comprehensive and broadly progressive platforms that all the Democratic candidates are putting forth when it comes to voting rights. Is that the best strategy? Is it sort of a parallel to, Republicans said we're going to have to reform Social Security, we're going to have to means test, we're going to have to, raise the retirement age. Democrats came back in the last couple of years and said, you know what? No, we're not going to play defense. We're going to play offense. We need to expand Social Security. And are the proposals in the voting rights realm similar in that sort of in that same vein?
I think that you're right that it's the same strategy. I think that the difference is that for people in terms of their livelihood, they hear Social Security and Medicare as something different than they don't quite see it the same way as a certain curb on your right to vote may not apply to me, therefore I don't care that much.
Right.
Just as a for instance is how people see it. I think that there has been an effort, although I do think again that some of it seems to be driven by a desire to turn out the base on the Democratic side.
Yeah.
So it's not quite as wholesale as Democrats would like it to be. It is about education. If you just put it to people, I mean, every time I've written a story about the Voting Rights Act and about restrictions or about any of these lawsuits, my Twitter feed will light up with people saying, voter ID is incredibly popular, because that's true. If you paint it as a binary to people, they'll say, well, of course. It's just not understanding exactly what that means. And I don't think that while I do think that there have been a lot of bold proposals by some of the candidates about how they would address this, it's not something they're talking about at every stop. It's not something that they're making centerpieces of their campaigns, and really only Hillary Clinton has the organizational piece at this point to try to sort of drill it down into the grassroots. Nobody else has the same kind of campaign apparatus. Bernie Sanders is the only one who would even come close at this point. So it's hard to push back when it's really just one person, and that one person is fighting her own battle, and you have a fairly gutted DNC apparatus, which realistically should be doing it as a party committee, but I think is struggling.
Yeah, I agree with Ari as well, though. I think it needs to be some sort of incentivized way of framing the argument, right? And we know that the Democrats aren't great on offense. The Republicans are always 7 steps ahead of us. That's why on the state houses they've got control of education and women's ovaries and everything else. They're on it. And then Democrats look up a few years later like, oh my gosh, it's over, right? So I think the Democrats really need to think about ways in which not only just making voting easier, but registration possibly. These are obviously conversations that aren't sexy conversations either. And they're conversations that the general electorate isn't very well educated on. So it's like we know the term voter ID, but that's not really in the common sort of political vernacular for a lot of voters. So there has to be an education piece, but then also this implementation piece. But I think the most successful strategy would be to say, well, don't you hate long lines, especially for people of color and poor people? I mean, those are the communities where voting is an 8-hour process. So when people say, oh, people of color aren't into democracy, it's like, they definitely are into democracy. They waited 7 hours to vote, something that no one else has to do because of their particular district or their address. So if Democrats could say, listen, we know that you waited in the rain, or you waited at this public school or this library and had to stand outside for half of the day, wouldn't it be great if you could vote 2 weeks ahead of time, right? Just come. I mean, and the infrastructure is there. I mean, I think this goes back to my point about who controls state houses or state secretaries of state, right? I mean, many Republicans don't want that, because then that just means more poor people and more people of color actually being incentivized to actually turn out and vote.
I'll just say one last thing about the voter ID argument, which is that voter ID came up in Nebraska recently. By no means anyone's example of a liberal legislature, even though it's like a nonpartisan legislature. It's structured in an interesting way. But many people thought it would pass, just like it's passed in so many other neighboring conservative states. But the law was defeated. And it was defeated in part by conservative Republicans.
Saying big government.
Saying,
yeah.
Why do we
Surveillance.
need government telling us how to vote?
Yeah.
Why do we need another big government restriction on voting when there's no need for it, when there's no evidence of fraud to back it up? To me, that was actually really refreshing to hear. Because if you're a small government, more libertarian-minded conservative, you don't want government to intervene where it's not necessary. And this is a classic example of creating a very expensive new program, because these IDs have to be free or else the Supreme Court's not going to uphold them. We know that now. And so a very expensive new taxpayer-funded entitlement for no good reason. And so I think that's something that you'd think many Republicans would be against. The one last thing I'll say about this is Nevada was another state that I was sure would pass voter ID law in 2015, because Nevada flipped, like North Carolina, from Democratic to Republican for the first time since 1929. And voter ID was at the top of the list to pass it, and you had people like Sharon Angle, who ran against Harry Reid, who were pushing for it very hard. And it didn't pass. And it may still pass in 2016, but it was surprising that it didn't pass because Republicans were in unified control of that state. Right. The governor, who's more of a moderate, wasn't so crazy about it. There were strong signals that if the legislature passed it, they would get sued. And so I'm not saying these things will always be defeated going forward, but I think there is less of a political incentive now in some cases for them to pass so quickly. And I think there's also a realization that there may be more of a backlash than originally anticipated.
It makes some sense given, I think the federal government owns like 90% of the land in Nevada, which has given rise to a huge anti-federal government and libertarian sentiment across that state. Do these victories or these defeats for voter ID in places like Nevada, do they offer a potential roadmap from a messaging and strategy standpoint for progressives around the country to try to adopt that kind of message in the same way that we've seen on, say, criminal justice reform? People like Rand Paul and some liberals get together on abolishing mandatory minimums, because of their libertarian interest in decriminalizing drugs. Do you think that's a good roadmap for?
Theoretically, I think it is, but I think it is lacking what you just described, which is essentially you have people at the edges of both parties who are coming together. In the case of criminal justice reform, on the right, it's because there's a financial incentive. Typically, it's, or at least that's a part of it. With Chris Christie, a little less so. His is much more about having experienced a friend who died of an overdose. But I'm not sure that I see right now what the incentive is that is going to bring the two edges together in the center. I do agree that I think that's the right map, but I think with the current landscape, I don't see how that happens.
You'd almost need some Cliven Bundy.
Was going through my head when you were talking about Nevada. Yes.
Who becomes a hero
Correct.
To the right based on the perceived persecution of this government ID.
Correct.
Wow. So what I'm going to do now, since I've asked them a lot of questions, and I definitely have some more questions for them, but I know that people in the audience probably have some questions too. So why don't we open it up and get some of y'all engaged as well? I know. Yes, so Talani has a microphone over there, and I think there's going to be a microphone on this side as well. So yeah, go ahead and stand up to the mic and be heard. Thank you very much. Good evening.
Years ago, I worked for a law firm, and we had a client who was a young 20s girl in Texas, and I don't remember whether she was an illegal alien or she had a student or temporary work visa, but she wasn't allowed to vote. But she registered at a street fair because some overeager volunteer kind of browbeat her into registration. And honestly, she didn't have a clue that it was illegal. But my question is, why would anyone commit voter fraud and vote when they weren't entitled to? Why would they risk a felony and serious jail time, no matter what some politician paid them?
Well, I don't think they would, and I think that's why it's so rare. And the only attempts that you really see on a concerted basis these days to try to steal an election, and it is incredibly rare, happens on an absentee level, where you can somehow get 100 or 200 or 300 ballots together. Like we saw this in the 1997 mayoral election in Miami, where dead people were voting, but they weren't voting in person. They were voting absentee. And so, I mean, there are things that we could do to try to tighten absentee ballots and regulate them more to prevent the small amount of voter fraud that's occurring. But instead, that's not even part of the discussion. As I mentioned earlier, it's all about in-person voter impersonation, which, among other things, as you mentioned, is just an incredibly stupid way to try to steal an election.
So we have a lot of things in this country that you do digitally now, right? What do you think? Given the fact that you can basically do all your banking at home, and the stakes are pretty high when you're talking about banking, aren't they? Yeah. You could trade as much stock as you want. You do it all online. Just based on knowing a password. What's the future for online voting?
Well, answer.
I don't think we're anywhere close to online voting because Pennsylvania just became the 23rd state to offer online registration. That means that 27 states don't even allow you to register to vote online, let alone vote online. And so I understand that there might be some issues with security and voting online, but it's crazy that you can't even register, that you can spend thousands of dollars online, but you're not entrusted to just do a simple registration process. And I have a piece coming out tomorrow about automatic voter registration because tomorrow is National Voter Registration Day. And many people think we have a voter turnout problem in this country, and we do. But we don't have a voter turnout problem. We have a voter registration problem because a quarter of Americans aren't registered to vote in this country. A quarter, 50 million Americans aren't registered to vote. But if you look at the last presidential election, 84% of registered voters actually voted. That's really, really high. If we had 84% voter turnout, everyone would say that we're doing great. But it's because so many Americans aren't registered that we have such low turnout.
We're in one of 3 New York City counties out of the 5 that is subject or was subject to the Voting Rights Act. Not all of North Carolina was subject. There were counties and cities and towns that were exempted because they met the proper standards. Yeah. Taking that of what's progressive and regressive, shouldn't people be looking at those states or elements of states where there is a progressive tradition and there are actions like North Carolina or Texas, despite the fact of the number that the Republicans have done, it is a metropolitan state and the metropolitan cores are bright blue. Or Kentucky, which really is not dependent upon coal. That's a whole kind of thing. Shouldn't they be really looking at something further down and not looking at the big thing and just throwing half the states away? Isn't this part of this?
Well, the formula that the Congress drew to try to cover those states
Let's back up just a tiny bit to make sure everyone understands the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which basically said that for most counties within most southern states, and then a few other counties around the country, because of a history of discriminatory behavior, they were subject to the pre-clearance laws. So that any change they had to make to their election laws had to be cleared by the federal government before taking effect.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you couldn't just name the states. You couldn't just say Alabama has to approve their voting changes. There had to be some sort of mechanism for covering them. And the mechanism they used in 1955 was those states that had less than 50% voter turnout in the 1964 presidential election, which basically meant those were places where people were disenfranchised and couldn't vote. And so that covered pretty much all of the southern states that were the biggest problem. It also covered some weird places, like a county in Idaho and some counties in other places that probably shouldn't have been covered. And over the years, many of those counties that had a clean record were able to bail out from the law. And so, and actually recently, a number of counties with clean records were able to get out from the Voting Rights Act, particularly that part of it, because there was no problem with them discriminating. I think the civil rights lawyers that have done a lot of litigation, their view of it, that this formula, while imperfect, was still catching the worst of the actors, and that an imperfect pre-clearance mechanism was far better than none. Because if you have none, what happens is that both bad laws will immediately go into effect, like in Texas, but that more states will have new incentives to not comply with the Voting Rights Act. Whereas before, just knowing that you had to approve your voting changes with the federal government kept a lot of stuff in check and kept a lot of crazy proposals from never even being discussed because they knew they weren't going to get approval for them.
So let me throw something out here. When this happened, when the Roberts Court struck down Section 5, and immediately a lot of liberals said, you know, we've got to go to Congress and they've got to reinstate Voter 5. I found that to be naive because it was fairly clear that no senator from Alabama, Jeffrey Sessions from Alabama, is never going to allow something that is perceived to single out Alabama to pass in this day and age. Given that, and I think our probably broad agreement on the panel about that you'd never get the votes, in the House or the Senate for that. what do you think the best strategy would be going forward, specifically with respect to the issue that the gentleman raises?
Well, it was a brilliant strategic move by John Roberts to just say, hey, Congress, you deal with this. The Congress that we all know has been functioning so well over the last few years. So he did this knowing full well Congress wasn't going to do anything. Lisa Murkowski of Alaska just became the first Republican to sign on to this new bill to restore the Voting Rights Act. And that was very significant because Murkowski was someone who lost to a Tea Party candidate and won as a write-in candidate as an independent in 2010. And she got a lot of votes from Native Alaskans. People don't realize that 20% of Alaska is made up of Native Alaskans. They've been treated very shamefully over the years. That's one reason why Alaska was one of those states that had to approve their voting changes with the federal government, was because of discrimination. So this isn't just a black and white issue. The Voting Rights Act encompasses many other groups that have been historically discriminated against: Asian Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans. So Murkowski had a different philosophy. Her philosophy was that she wanted these ethnic minorities to vote for her, that she wanted to present a different face for the Republican Party. How do we change the Republican Party so that they care more about those voters than they do about a Tea Party challenge? I mean, I think that's a very difficult question that relates to so many issues. I mean, there actually are very, very, very good political reasons why Republicans would support immigration reform, right, Chrissy? And they still won't even support that. So, I mean, if they're not going to support immigration reform,
just not enough to pass it.
yeah, not enough to pass it. But if they're not going to do that, then how are they going to support a restored Voting Rights Act?
I think also, Republicans in a primary behave very differently than Republicans in a general election. And that's in their home districts as well, right? And so many of them are feeling so much pressure to say and do particular things that are anti-immigrant, anti-Latino, anti-black, whatever it may be, to hopefully eke out a win against a particular portion of the population that actually comes out, in September or June or whenever the state is actually holding their primary. I mean, I think, I agree with you completely, Ari, about turnout. I mean, we have a severe registration problem. That's why I think it's so important. I mean, this book that I'm writing about all these failed black candidates for the presidency, I mean, the big takeaway is that they registered black people, right? That's, when you really think about registration wholesale, anyone who registers Americans is doing a service and contributing to the larger electoral map in ways that we can't even calculate sometimes decades later, just because voting is hereditary, right? So if your parents voted, you're much more likely to vote when you're younger, right? And so the people that Jesse Jackson registered, ostensibly, if they had kids, voted for Obama, most likely, if we look at the data. So I think with Republicans, though, I mean, it gets a little precarious just because they have to behave a particular way well before it's time for them to go in a general election.
It's really quite striking when you think about where the Republican Party was in literally just 2 years ago.
Yes.
Because it was the late summer of 2013, and they put out this autopsy. Reince Priebus,
Growth
the chairman,
and Opportunity Report. It was called.
Exactly.
Donald Trump was their solution.
But there was really only one. The whole autopsy was about style. It was really style over substance, except for one thing. The only substantive recommendation in the entire autopsy was let's do comprehensive immigration reform, because this is a threshold issue until we show that we can look like a more tolerant party and be more friendly to minorities. We're not only going to, basically what they're thinking is we're not only losing minorities, but we're probably losing suburban women swing voters that probably want us to look like a tolerant party.
Yeah, you have to remember also that, I mean, I keep thinking as we're having this conversation about a phone call that Mitt Romney did with his donors right after he lost the election. And he kept talking about how Obama had promised people, quote unquote, free stuff.
Yeah.
Or he said gifts. I forget what the word was. I think it might have been gifts. But it was about, there was free health care, free this, free that. And
Made America sound like Sweden.
Right. There was this all does tie into what we're talking about. And so, yeah. I mean, there is this, what you're talking about with the Growth and Opportunity Report, which was commissioned by Reince Priebus, the chairman of the Republican National Committee. There are few people who welcomed Donald Trump with more open arms than Reince Priebus in 2011 when he was talking about running and when he was championing birtherism. I mean, Reince found him to be very attractive because he thought he could be a fundraiser. And that is where you have seen the seeds of a lot of what you're seeing now. As soon as the establishment put out, we should pass comprehensive immigration reform, it almost codified this is not something that the base is ever going to do. And the base was not there anyway. The base hears it as, you want to bring in 11 million more people to steal our wages. And so this all ties in.
And to tie it back to Ari's fabulous book, we're talking in a really pessimistic way, I fear, tonight. And I don't mean to be too pessimistic or demobilizing, but there are some really poignant and inspiring anecdotes in the book, and one of them is the portrayal of John Lewis, a real hero in this movement. And during his congressional tenure, there was a juncture at which basically a lot of black civil rights leaders did not want to open up the Voting Rights Act for amendments, even though there was a real interest in helping Latinos along the border who were facing a lot of discrimination. And there was an amendment that could have helped them, and Ari could talk about it perhaps more specifically, but basically John Lewis was the guy who stood up and said, you know what, yeah, we may have to open it up, and yeah, they could try to make, to try to water down the whole Voting Rights Act if we open it up, but what good is the whole thing anyway if we don't broaden it to anyone who needs it, black, brown, yellow? And that was a pretty inspiring moment in the book, Ari.
Thank you. And I think it hits at a larger thing, which is that the Voting Rights Act has really impacted so many Americans. I think it was passed for obvious reasons, principally to deal with the disenfranchisement of black Americans in the South, and it was very successful at ending that. But in 1970, for example, when it was reauthorized, it abolished literacy tests nationwide and lowered the voting age to 18 for all federal elections. That enfranchised 9 million new people. In 1975, as Jeff mentioned, it was expanded to cover Latinos and Asian Americans and Native Americans and other language minority groups. And what that meant is that states like Texas, that had a long history of voting discrimination against Hispanics, they had to approve their voting changes with the federal government. It also meant that there were bilingual ballots distributed all across the country, because English-only ballots in many places had functioned as de facto literacy tests, not just in the South, but in places in the West and in the North and in New York City. And so I think the Voting Rights Act, for good reason, is thought of something that has principally helped African Americans, and it has. But I'm trying to make the case that it's helped all Americans, and that we need to think about this more broadly, because I think one reason why people sort of took the Voting Rights Act for granted or didn't know a lot about it, because I think they sort of felt like, number one, it wasn't relevant anymore, but number two, that it only helped a certain segment of voters. And I think it's much bigger than that.
So Maggie and I joked about Cliven Bundy. Could Tim Scott be the hero for the Republican Party on this? Could Tim Scott be the person, given how much respect he got kind of from the Tea Party, black U.S. Senator from South Carolina? And Ari, in his opening conversation, talked about the fact that in 1870, there's a black U.S. Senator, Blanche K. Bruce from Mississippi. There's a black governor of Louisiana, this guy named PBS Pinchback. This is 1870, right? And then we go over 100 years before you have black, statewide top of the ticket officials, from the South. And now we have a black U.S. Senator from South Carolina, conservative Republican, supported by the Tea Party. And he was so popular when he first ran for Congress, he beat Strom Thurmond's son and the son of a former governor, Carroll Campbell, in a primary. And so he had real Tea Party credibility. Yes. Could he be somebody who could emerge as a hero? Either one, for any of the three of you.
Theoretically, I think yes. I mean, I'm trying not to be in the predictions game. I guess the only thing that I would say is that I don't see anything like what you're talking about happening during a presidential cycle that is as polarized as what we're seeing right now. I just don't see it. I mean, you may disagree, but
right. Well, I also think this is where descriptive and substantive come in. I mean, Tim Scott does not represent, I would say, 92% of African American voters, right? And I think oftentimes black Republicans stay away from issues that seem like black issues.
Right.
And so I don't know if he would touch this issue, and if he touched it, I don't know what team he would be on and what side.
I mean, Tim Scott seemed generally moved after Charleston happened and seemed more open to supporting criminal justice issues.
Trying not to give you full side eye.
That he had maybe not supported in the past. However, to get back on your good side, I was with Tim Scott in Selma for the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, and 100 members of Congress traveled with John Lewis, and I was lucky enough to be there. And many, particularly the Democratic members of Congress, wanted to use the 50th anniversary of the Selma March to raise awareness about the need to strengthen the Voting Rights Act. And Tim Scott said, we need to decouple Selma from the Voting Rights Act, which is totally insane. I mean, Selma and the Voting Rights Act are like this. You could never decouple them. Selma is the Voting Rights Act. So for Tim Scott to say that made me extremely pessimistic about his ability to be a leader on this issue.
Well said. Well said. Other questions from the audience?
Jeff, I got a
Oh,
question here. Sorry.
Serge,
Hey, how are you?
my student.
How are you? I just wanted to ask about sort of the xenophobic underpinning of the current chipping away of the Voting Rights Act. Do you really think it's about sort of this new demographic that's coming up as far as, Latinos and people of color, younger people? Do you really believe that's part of this whole chipping away of the Voting Rights Act?
I guess that's directed to me. I mean, I think that Republicans are increasingly who are the ones who are backing these restrictions and these restrictive suits and these restrictive new bills in their state houses are increasingly backed by an older white working class base. And Democrats are not. I mean, one of the stranger things about this election cycle has been the resurrection of the phrase silent majority. It's a silent minority. And so so I do think that some of it speaks specifically to who Republicans who are supporting maneuvers like this think are their voters. I don't know that I think it's hard to impinge motive. That's not for me to do, but I think that if you just look at who their voters are and look at who the Democrats' voters are, this is not going to benefit Republican voters to have these restrictions. It's going to benefit Republicans. It's not going to benefit Democrats, and that just is what it is.
I think at the state level, it's largely driven by partisanship. I think that if African American voters or Hispanic voters or young voters voted in larger measure for Republican candidates, they wouldn't be pushing these things. But I think it's naive to suggest that race isn't part of this. You look at John Roberts and his writings since he was a young lawyer in the 1980s. He's obsessed with race. This is something that has motivated him. The idea that drawing a district to help a black candidate or Hispanic candidate will lead to something like affirmative action. I mean, this is an argument that he makes so relentlessly, and not just in voting rights sphere. When he says in a school integration case, the way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. I think he really believes this, and I think this has captured a large part of the conservative legal establishment. And so I think if maybe it's because of ideology, but that ideology has serious racial overtones, and it fundamentally, I think, doesn't capture the history of America. And so, I mean, I think that people are uncomfortable saying that, but I think there's no way that you can look at John Roberts' record on all these issues and think that he doesn't have some sort of race problem.
Can I just chime in real
You
quick?
may.
I also think that the Republicans are really effective with selling fear, right? So when you look at the rhetoric of a large portion of these candidates, which is, taking our country back, it's a lot of the past, because the past was so awesome for them, right? And now it's terrible, right? So you've got women stealing your jobs, you've got people of color stealing your jobs, you've got immigrants stealing everything, according to Donald Trump, and so this rhetoric really does resonate with people who feel like the makeup of this country is changing drastically, and they're not a part of it, and they're not a part of the leadership, and public schools are now more, I don't use the word minority because globally I'm a majority, so people of color are now the majority of people in public schools. And so there's this widespread defunding of public schooling. So there are all these things that Republicans are keenly aware of because they're usually a few steps ahead of the Democrats. And it's fear-based, and it's really effective. But I think we also have to remember that there's a lot more movement on the state level when it comes to people of color. So yes, in a presidential election, you can count on African Americans voting at 91 and 93%. But depending on what state you're in, it's not always 91 or 93%. So there are some Republicans who resonate with African Americans on a statewide level, but there's something with the translation process when it comes to every 4 years. But I think what many of us are arguing is we also need to pay attention to the elections that aren't sort of the big wig elections.
Speaking of the effectiveness of this rhetoric, a recent poll by the Public Religion Research Institute found that 52% of white Americans agreed with the following statement. Today, discrimination against whites has become as big a problem as discrimination against blacks. Right. So, let me get this question.
What are your thoughts on all-male elections? All-male, of course, not as in no women, but
I was
as in MAIL. And my understanding is that the 3 states in which it's been implemented, they've seen an expected increase in turnout, but modestly, only a few percentage points. Of course, saves a lot of costs and is longer period. So the pros are obvious, but groups like Project Vote have come out against it because they look at the data and they actually see the increase really only happening in groups that traditionally have higher participation rates already, but they didn't see any increase in groups that are traditionally lower participation rates, like communities of color and low-income communities. So do you support it?
Don't just pick the book up, buy the book back there.
Yeah, my daughter has to eat. So I think it's an interesting concept. I mean, it seems like it's worked pretty well in Oregon and in Washington. I can't remember the third state. Colorado may be moving towards it. I'm not sure they've adopted it yet. There are statistics that show that voters of color are less likely to have absentee ballots counted, for example, than white voters. And many African Americans, particularly that grew up in the segregated South, want to vote in person. And it's very meaningful for them, and they feel like that's the only way their vote will count. And so I don't see us moving to an all-male future. All-male as in all-male ballot future. I still think that people are going to want to vote in person, and that there's still sort of ceremonial aspects of voting that are important to people, that are important educationally, that people like it, and they like to be part of the process. There's people that like to be poll workers every election. Yes. And so, I mean, I think it works well in certain places, but I don't think it's going to be adopted nationwide.
Right. So full disclosure, I'm on the board of Project Vote, just full disclosure. I don't think that, I don't like that idea. In theory, it seems fantastic. But I think there's a generational divide as well. And I agree with Ari completely. I mean, if you have sort of, especially African-American voters over the age of 60, I mean, there is something about sort of standing up and being counted, right? Because these are people who oftentimes, if they're from the South, and even the North, right? I mean, I feel like Mark Twain lets us know that the North can be just as vicious as the South, but they have very vivid memories of being turned away, right? And there is this widespread distrust of the polity and not having votes counted and things like that. So, like, just knowing physically that you have done your duty, what they do beyond that is on them, but you know for a fact that you've done it, right? And anyone who's ever spent any time in the U.S. Postal Service knows that many people would not feel comfortable putting something so important in the hands of the USPS.
So I'm going to ask one final question to the panel, and it's based on my belief that a panel where everyone agrees and almost everyone in the audience probably agrees too is not a good panel. So I want to have a little dissension here. Yeah. No, but now we're going to have some dissension here, I hope. One outgrowth of the Voting Rights Act was the Thornburg versus Gingell's decision, 1986 Supreme Court decision, that essentially, I think, facilitated the creation of districts that enabled minority voters to elect candidates of their choice. That created the 5th district in Georgia, which elected John Lewis. It created districts after the 1990 redistricting that elected 2 black congressmen to North Carolina for the first time in almost 100 years, and in other places throughout the South. Similar results. 2 years later, in those states where those districts were created, Democrats lost ground. 4 years later, in 1994, and there were obviously other things going on, but Democrats lost a ton of ground. Democrats went in a state like Georgia from 9-1 in the congressional delegation to 9 Democrats, and Newt Gingrich being the only Republican, to being down 3-8. 3 black Democrats and 8 white Republicans.
I like how you say this for the last question. It's the most complicated question to answer.
It's a complicated.
All right.
So now subsequent decisions such as Shaw versus Reno have watered down the power of that original decision. Can you talk about how you think, I would like all the panelists to talk about whether ultimately this has been a good thing or a bad thing for progressive interests?
Well, I don't think that's necessarily either or. I think it's been both. There was no way to get so many black members of Congress elected without drawing these districts. That just was a fact. Before all these majority-minority districts were drawn, you only had 2 black members of Congress from the South in a region where they made up 25% of the population. So you wouldn't have got Bobby Scott from Virginia and Jim Clyburn from South Carolina and Terry Sewell from Selma. And I've come to really appreciate all these people, having talked to them and learned their life stories. It's not just about getting one person there. That one person represents a whole history that in some ways has been overcome by them coming there. But I also think that these districts were drawn in cooperation with Republicans, in many cases by Republicans, to benefit Republican interests. So there were 2 largely underrepresented groups in the South in the 1980s. They were black Democrats and white Republicans.
Yeah.
And they both benefited because of this. And so 2 things can be true. I think now there's something of a rethink going on about the drawing of these districts. I think what's happened is that districts that were 60% black have become 70% black as a result of the latest redistricting cycle. And I think many black members of Congress are unhappy about that. They would like to see the percentages lowered. But I don't think—
Not necessarily for their own district, but for other black members' districts.
Certainly sometimes for their districts. So I think that it's a complicated question, but I don't think there's any easy solution. And to say that drawing of these districts were the main factor that led the Republican Party to become the party of the South, I think is ahistorical and wrong.
Well, I think they also just, using the example of Georgia, I mean, they packed the districts so terribly. I mean, yes, they worked in conjunction with Republicans, and Republicans said, if you want to make an 85% Democratic district, sure thing, right? And so just strategically, mathematically, it was inappropriate. And so that's why they switched from 9-1 to, 3-8 or whatever. Yeah, it's 3-8. And so when we think about redistricting and gerrymandering and packing and cracking districts, we also have to think about math and realize that sometimes, depending on how you draw the district, maybe a district that's 60% Democrat is suffice. It may not be strong enough for you as the elected official.
Right,
you may
right.
have some tense primaries
Yeah.
with someone in your own party, right? And I mean, also Georgia has open primaries, right? So we've seen, like with Cynthia McKinney, with Republicans voting for the weaker Democratic challenger to knock her off the ballot, and then putting up a Republican to run against this weak, first time elected official, who's got the Democratic nominee. So I think when we think about cracking and packing districts, I think we need to think about our percentages as well. And to have a 90% Democratic or black district is just completely ineffective. But I mean, I don't know if I necessarily follow the logic of, okay, we got all these black people in Congress and we lost all these.
I didn't pose it as a causal relationship, but temporarily there was a relationship, and that's all I suggested. Maggie, any thoughts to close up?
I'm not trying to make this a bad panel because I think this was a pretty good panel, but I agree with Ari that I think this is a complicated question.
Yeah.
And that's why we have one party that has most of the governorships and many of the state legislators. And guess who does the redistricting?
Yeah.
The state legislature.
Yeah.
So when people don't get out and vote in the off-year election,
Yeah.
that's what you get.
Yeah.
And we have a big problem right here in New York State because we are number 49. We are number 49 out of 50 states in voter participation.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah. No, I mean, I wasn't suggesting that everything's all well and good with voter turnout, particularly in off-year elections. I was just making the point that when you look at why voter turnout is so bad, the fact that there are so many unregistered Americans is really a major contributing factor. I don't know what turnout among registered voters is in off-year elections. Do you know, Chrissy?
No, but I mean, the fact that we even call them off-year elections is what I always press upon my students, right? I mean, it implies that we're off. And so whatever we're doing is just bonus, right? Yeah. It's a non-presidential year, but it's not even off.
And and usually around 35%
Yeah.
of registered voters in off
And
year.
we know
So
in New York City and New York State, I mean, voter participation is drastically declining. I mean, when we look at the data from Dinkins versus Giuliani, I mean, those numbers are quadruple what we saw with de Blasio versus Lota. But I mean, I actually argue that in New York City / New York State, it's a little different, and it's not necessarily about voter apathy, but voter fatigue, because we're asked to vote essentially every single year, multiple times a year, if you're an active voter.
Well, I want to thank Ari Berman for his fantastic book. I want to thank all the panelists. Can we give them all a round of applause? And I want to thank all of you for coming out, and you can do two things. You can learn about the fascinating history of voting rights, and you can help feed Ari's newborn daughter by buying a book that he's going to sign right at that table right now. So thank you again.
Start shamelessly exploiting our children. Yeah.